Welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne, a place where we have conscious conversations about things that really matter in our lives. And now here's your host, Roxanne Derhodge.
Hi everyone, it's Roxanne Derhodge. Thanks for tuning in again today to Authentic Living with Roxanne. Today I have somebody that I think is going to be kind of fascinating, and her name is Brandy Maslowski, and she is a different background from someone that I think I would have interviewed before, because she has unique skills in quilting, which I know nothing about, which I have to admit, and how that plays through with healing. So Brandy is a speaker as well, and so I'm very, very curious about what she does in the world, and how does one grow up to go out and speak and train and heal others through quilting. So Brandy, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Roxanne. I'm really excited to be on this show because this is just such an important topic, talking about how we can use craft in our life to help with our own personal healing.
Well, I often think, right? So I have a son, and when he was young, I would do crafts, and then he kind of phased out, right? So, I did it, which I loved. Because when you're younger, you think nothing of all the stuff that it's such an important part of play, right? We think nothing of it, but when you start to kind of get older, and you don't think of it as an option. So I think I love the fact that you do it, and I want to learn kind of what you do. And for people that are listening to the audio, you're not going to see this room that Brandy's in, but I can see there's like spools of stuff and drawers, and there's a Canadian flag back there in a picture. It just looks like a kind of place that you'd want to tinker around in. So Brandy, tell me, how did this is going to be interesting. How did this all get started?
Well, it is kind of an interesting story because I have moved in my career from firefighter to quilter, to quilt professional. And it's kind of like one of those stories where you've taken your side gig, your passion, and you've made it your real deal. But I have a history in firefighting in central Canada. I was a firefighter for 15 years before I moved across Canada to BC. And in those 15 years as a firefighter, I experienced a great deal of traumatic incidents on the scenes, and moved into the public education to sort of get away from that, what I was seeing and trying to deal with. And then once I moved into public education, I had the trauma of a toxic workplace. So there are all kinds of things that have happened along my life that, made me feel like I was too much, or I was not enough, or, I felt like people were saying, who do you think you are being a female in this man's world? And those kind of things. So I dealt with all that for many, many years. And eventually I just had to walk away from that because I couldn't cope with how to deal with it or make it better. I wasn't going to change other people. I had to fix myself and deal with the healing myself. So we moved across Canada, and my passion for quilting was always something that I did on the side. And I didn't realize until a decade into it that I was using this craft as a form of healing for myself. And, every time something traumatic happened in my life, whether it was the workplace or the loss of a grandparent, I would dive into my craft room or my studio, and I would just start creating, and it would really help me work through those emotions. So that's kind of the beginnings of my story, and it just blossomed from there.
So let's back up a little bit, because that's an untraditional career, right? At the time, you were probably getting, and it's still pretty untraditional for females. It's I would say it's coming along, but it's still not a conventional job that we would hear about a lot of females going into. What made you want to enter into firefighting?
That's a really good question because I don't like looking back. I think, why on earth did I put myself through that career? But the reality is, I had an English degree. I didn't know what I was going to do. Was I going to become a poet? Like, what do you do with an English degree? Was I going to go into education or physical education or something like that? And right at the time when I graduated from university, I saw this big ad in the newspaper for, we're looking for firefighters. And I thought, I mean, it just hit me right in the heart because, I mean, decades later, having gone through years and years of counseling, I know that I became a firefighter because my dad's a firefighter and I wanted to please him. And my uncle's a firefighter. My great grandfather's a firefighter. And it really hit me in the heart. But back then, I had no idea I was trying to please a father in a family that was split up and all that kind of stuff. Now I understand what I did. But going into firefighting, I really believed that women were equal and there, everything was kind of wonderful and, women's lib was over. But I was really quite wrong when I got into it. And I face the challenges every single day that women face to this day on jobs that are primarily led by men.
Hmm. So interesting, right? Like, because you grew up in a family that clearly, as a girl, you thought nothing of entering a male dominated kind of environment. So you think, hey, I'm gonna become a firefighter, right? And
Yeah.
then you go in. What were some of the, I'm gonna say, rude awakenings that you came up against as a young firefighter?
Well, the first kind of surprise was that my father was so supportive and amazing going through the process of becoming a firefighter. But the first thing he said to me was, "Oh no, you don't want to be a firefighter." And I was like, "I can do it." He goes, "Oh, there's no question in my mind you can do it." He goes, "But you're going to be dealing with some stuff." He knew how I was going to be treated before I even got on. But regardless, he backed me up, supported me, lifted me up. We worked so hard together to help me pass the physicals and everything. But the big thing that I encountered, the first thing that really opened my eyes, was in the job related physical. So it was a 9-month process way back then in 1995. It was 9 months to get on the job for me. And we went through all these different testings and physicals. And the last thing was the job related physical. And I went to that physical. There was about maybe 24 people that day doing the job related physical, all men. I was the only female that day. And one by one, people were failing out because they dropped something or fell off. They got tested for their, I don't know, their vision, and they found out they were colorblind and they didn't know it. Or, there were people dropping like flies one by one. And there was probably about 18 of us left. And we were cheering each other on. The men were cheering for me. I was cheering for them. We all kind of got cohesive there. But the last thing we did that day was the ladder lift. And this is the thing I'll describe, where you have to walk up to a line, pick up a ladder, put it on a wall, and then take it back off the wall and put it back behind the line without lifting your ankles when you put it on the wall. And taking female male out of the equation, this is a hard exercise to do if you're short. And I'm generally shorter than the average man. I'm 5'8", so I'm pretty tall, but
Which is not short.
Yeah, I know. And so, but a lot of men are 6 foot tall, right? And this was designed for men. All these exercises were designed with men in mind. And so this was really difficult for me to do. And so I did it, and I had practiced in my dad's barn over and over again. We knew this test was coming. I walked up there and slammed that ladder on the wall, picked it up, put it back, slammed it down, and I cheered like alone, saying, yes. So I did it, right? But the problem with the whole test was, at the end there, before we started that test, the officers called my name first to do it first. And then they brought me into this secluded outbuilding and closed the doors, and we do it in seclusion. I was like, oh, okay. So I did it. And then when he came out and opened the doors, my dad was there in plain clothes, and he was looking at me and he's like, did you do it? And I said, well, of course I did. I would have been kicked out if I didn't do it. And then my dad kind of looked away, kind of sheepishly, like he kind of knew oh, they might have given me a second chance because I'm the token female. And
Oh,
what they did in that moment was they flew open the doors, they corralled all the other men in, and they all did it in front of everyone. And I was the only one who did it in seclusion. And from that moment on, I realized, like, oh, no one's ever going to know that I did it myself. They're going to think I got a few chances. I'll never be able to prove that I really did it. Right. So,
what an opportunity to have demonstrated
yeah,
your prayer capacity.
yeah,
Like, on the first, you didn't even know you had a second go.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
So,
So that was the first inroads into recognizing that
yeah,
maybe the disparity that Dad was alluding to was really, in fact, deep rooted in kind of
yeah.
the field that you were picking.
Yeah, and he knew, like he really knew deep down that I was going to be treated quite poorly throughout my career, but he also really believed I'd be able to deal with it. And the next big thing that really was kind of crushing, like kind of, you can get your spirit crushed a little bit by bit. And the next thing that happened immediately in the first 16 weeks of training, once I got on the job, was the officer in charge told, there was a couple females in the class, which was really unusual. And he told two of us who had long hair that we had to cut our hair off. And he said it was in the collective agreement, and he made it sound so official. And there was this beautiful Black woman, a friend of mine, who had to cut her braids off, and I cut my hair off. And when we got on the job after 16 weeks and we met a couple of the other women on the job, they were like, you did what? You do not have to cut your hair off. You simply have to have it off your collar and curled up and under your helmet. And I was so devastated, mostly for Rose, really, because she had these gorgeous lifelong braids. And never to this day has she ever grown them back. I mean, I was lucky, my hair grows quite quickly, but
Brandy, what year was this in?
that was 1995.
Wow, not that long ago.
Yeah.
Wow, wow.
And when we confronted him later, like, we didn't have to cut it. He's like, yeah, well, you really should have. I wanted you. I thought, like, it was not, it was his own personal decision to tell us that. And it wasn't anything we were required to do. So it was pretty sad.
A lot of opportunity to have things to heal from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Other than the actual tasks associated with what happens in firefighting.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think, like, I would say the first 5 years when I was on the fire trucks, the thing that hurt me most was the trauma that I saw in the field, the people who were in distress. That hurt me the most and was buried the deepest. And it's the stuff I've really had to deal with to this day. I loved the men I worked with in the fire halls, and I was really able to deal with, the men I worked with by rolling things off the back and having a lot of comedy involved. And I worked super hard and took every course, and I was like top of my class in everything. So the fact that I excelled so well really kept me, in the good books with a lot of these men. But moving into a toxic workplace afterwards for the last 10 years of that career was extremely difficult, because I worked with men who hated me being there, and they hated that I was senior to them, and they didn't feel it was appropriate that I was, in a job that's only for them. And so that was just day to day, like the last 10 years of my career was just
which is a long time.
Yeah.
Doing the kind of work. So of course, if you want to kind of tell them some of the things, PTSD is just, I often say, and maybe you're better at defining this, but I often say that we're not wired for some of the things that, say, I was a first responder with the police in Toronto, and I was with a team of 14 other responders. We were victim services. We respond to the victims of crime. I'm sure you know of, because you would be deployed oftentimes at the same time as the police. On my team, and goodness, I was probably I was talking about 1991. They would do these psychological tests, and we had a team of 14, of which all of us showed high levels of PTSD, and one person on our team was suicidal. So it shows you, and I stayed in that role for 5 years, right? So we're not equipped as human beings. I think short-term stress, absolutely, but in these EMS roles, police, paramedic, firefighting, police officers, first responders, like in my case, the body and the brain can only adapt to certain things, and then eventually, what happens is that we I'm going to say they'll use the word split our thought and feeling to be able to cope and be able to keep ourselves together. But the brain and the body eventually keeps those symptoms that shows itself in other ways. So I don't know if that makes sense, or if there's something that you would share from your perspective. What are some of the symptoms that started to develop in you that made you think, oh, I gotta do some healing stuff for me?
Well, the first real experience where I realized something is seriously wrong. Something is seriously wrong was I asked, one of the chiefs if I could go to this workshop, the city workshop called Stress in the Workplace. I wanted to learn about, because I was just like not doing well and I was sick and I couldn't figure out what was wrong with my body. It all became physical for me and I got very, very ill, lost like 20 pounds. And I went to this Stress in the Workplace. And so during this seminar, we learned all about stress in the workplace. And then we filled out a stress test at the end. And then I think we were supposed to get sent our results. But the next morning at 7 a.m., 7:30 a.m., something like that, I remember I was sitting in my car, just kind of frozen, kind of dreading going in. And I just sat there. And I waited till the last second. And then 5 minutes before I had to be there, I ran into work. And I thought, this is just not right. I don't even want to go into the workplace. And I got a phone call the minute I sat down at my desk on my start time from the person who led that Stress in the Workplace. And she said, how are you right now? And I said, I'm good. And she goes, I'm looking at the results of your stress test and I'm thinking maybe you should come in and have a chat with me. And I was like, oh, okay. And she said, you are in the most suicidal zone of anyone who's ever taken this stress test of anyone I've ever seen. She actually told me that once I got in there and we were talking about it and I was like, I am not suicidal, I promise. And she goes, I understand that you're not suicidal, but you have zero self-care. And she said, did you brush your hair today? And I realized I hadn't. She said, did you have a shower? Did you brush your teeth today? And I hadn't. I had rolled out of bed, thrown my hair in a ponytail, gotten on my wrinkled uniform and gone to work, and my self-care was gone. So that made me really realize, okay, something's seriously wrong. And there was another little situation with my child that really made me realize, okay, I have to quit my job immediately because this is just not working for me. And just to tell the quick story, I came home from work on a day that I had this really, really toxic verbal encounter with one of my coworkers. And, he was accusing me of trying to get him fired. All this crazy stuff was going on. And I just could not care less about them or their jobs or anything like that. And I wasn't trying to do anything. And I came home from work and my husband took one look at me and he said, oh, I'll go make dinner. And he just turned around and went into the kitchen. I went straight downstairs and started stitching. And I was in full uniform with my bars and my tunic on and my tie. I didn't have my cap on, but I was in full uniform stitching away. And my son comes to the door of my sewing room and he says, Mommy, I want to play clay. And I just brushed him off and said, something along the lines of, if I could just get these, eye masks made and these oven mitts made, I'll have a good craft show this weekend and I could just quit my job, and to a 6-year-old, that is like a little bit beyond. He just rolls off his back and he's like, oh, well, okay, I'll go play. And then a little while later, he comes back into my room with a handful of paper money that he had made for me so that I could quit my job.
Oh my goodness.
And I just burst into tears. I had this sudden realization. I haven't even greeted my child. I hadn't picked him up. I hadn't swung him around. I literally slunk down into the basement just to try to do something methodical with my mind to get over what I'd had to face that day. And, that money that my son made for me made more it meant more to me than any other money I will ever make in my life. And it made me realize I need to focus on my family. I need to focus on self-care, and I need to leave this situation immediately. And that was my first big realization. Okay, we've got to figure something else out.
And it's funny, right? Like, when I decided to go into the psychological field, I was a first responder at 22 years old, right? And I remember, my very first call. This is me, right? Like, I'm ready. I'm 22. I know everything, don't I?
Yeah.
And of course, I had to learn how to drive an unmarked police car, I had the miter, all that stuff, right? So you're like, I'm thinking I'm 22, what did I know? And I remember our first call is a suicide call. So my partner, who had been on, they paired you up obviously with a partner that would done it for a while, and the fear, I remember we were going, it's in Toronto, and I'm like, oh my God, this is real. This is what's flying through my head. And, here you have these things about I'm going to help someday. And you really, from the bottom of my heart, that's why I picked it. And then I remember saying, my partner saying to me, she goes, so we can make the block. We can circle the block. And I said to her, yeah. And this is my very first call. So my visceral human reaction is kicking in even before going in. And this, you would understand this. And she says to me, of course, she's been in that role. She goes, well, we can hope. And this, the concept of the humor being, I'm probably going to be called out in this, but the Black humor of trauma.
Yeah.
And she said, well, I hope it's a clear wound.
Yeah.
And I went, what? Not thinking about it. Now entering the scene.
Yeah.
It was, meaning that there wasn't, this as a firefighter, there wasn't devastation everywhere. And then of course we're dealing with the family, right? As the coroner is taking the body out on the other end. And for the first time, this is my first call. I'm like, and we were there, I don't know how many hours, obviously, to deal with the family. And the cumulative effect of that, I think people don't understand. And you would get it. You were a firefighter. I lasted, like I said, 4 to 5 years in mine. But what's happening, like you're seeing that over and over again, and the body and the brain has nowhere to put it. And if you're not getting the right support or the right outlet, where's it going to go?
Yeah.
It has to go somewhere, right?
True. Yeah. And it was so many years before I even realized that I had PTSD. It was literally only 5 years ago that I was diagnosed with complex PTSD. And the reason that happened was because moving across Canada to BC, I got a few different jobs, but the job that was most fire related here was fire services supervisor. So I was in charge of 7 different volunteer fire departments. And something happened along the way where 2 different firefighters that I was responsible for, I needed to get them counseling because they had experienced something traumatic and they weren't coming back to the job. And I was reaching out to them and I was trying to give them the numbers for counseling, and they're like, no, we're good. But they weren't coming back. They weren't volunteering anymore. So I went to a conference in Victoria. It was fantastic. It had a lot of public education aspects to it, but there were 3 or 4 different seminars on counseling, PTSD support, team building type of things. And I went to this PTSD one, and previously I always associated PTSD with the military. As a firefighter myself, I literally had never even considered that firefighters would have PTSD. We're like, we can deal with it ourselves. Like we just don't even talk about that. And so I'm looking at this PTSD presentation, and he's talking about all the different things. And then he lists off a dozen things that you want to watch for if your firefighters have experiences, they might have PTSD, and you might want to bring in support. And I had personally experienced 10 of the 12 things that he was talking about in my career, in just the 5 years I was on the trucks.
Yeah.
And so after that presentation, I thought, oh my gosh, I might have PTSD. I went into a washroom and sat on a toilet fully clothed And I just burst into tears. And I phoned my husband and I was like, do you think everyone who watches this seminar just thinks they have PTSD? And he goes, no, Brandy, no. He goes, just go and check it out. Go for counseling and find out. And just 5 years ago, I went to counseling and I went to 4 or 5 sessions. And finally, I said to the counselor, I said, are we kind of ruling this out, or do you think I have PTSD? And he goes, oh my goodness. He goes, I diagnosed you on the first appointment. If I haven't been clear, I'm not doing my job very well. But yes, you have complex PTSD, and you've been dealing with it, whether you know it or not, with quilting for decades. So
Wow.
you've kind of been self-soothing that way. So, and it was such, some people might think, oh, it's such a big label. You're labeled with, no, it's not a label. It's a freedom, actually, to be diagnosed, because you know that you're not crazy. You know that you don't have a physical illness or something that it's the actual anxiety and trauma that you're experiencing over and over again that causes those physical symptoms, and you can manage it. You can really
Absolutely. And it's, what I often say, Brandy, and I've been a first responder. I worked for one of the biggest behavioral health companies in Canada. Now they're international, but even before that, I was in EAP services. So I was, I would do trauma responses. So, I mean, I've lost count of how many I did over my career. And still, I can still remember the one. It was a murder suicide.
Yeah.
And it was 11 Division in Toronto. It's funny how you remember the details.
Yeah.
And I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. That's where I grew up. And it was a Trinidadian family.
Mm.
And they had 6 children. And what happened was, generally, with all the 911, the police were supposed to inform the 6 children. Well, guess what happened? There was a mishap. So myself and my partner had to inform all 6 children that they no longer had parents. And the one little one, and I was telling the story to my friend the other day, one of my girlfriends the other day. I think the littlest one, there was a clown. We had stickers, and of course, you're trying to deliver this message, and we were coloring it. And I think the little child took the sticker and stuck it on my jacket. Mm-hmm. And I came home, and for about maybe 4 to 6 months, that sat on that jacket. And then eventually one day I was going through it, and I thought, I have to get rid of this. And that memory will, I know, last with me for the rest of my life. Yeah. So, if you think about soothing and the fact that you're sharing about dysregulation, and, we need first responders because unfortunately bad things happen in all our lives. But it's the things that happen in their worlds, like in your world with your little boy, because you're trying to go back home and be mommy and wife and friend and part of your society, your community, and it's not just letting it happen like it did for me. So that's why soothing is such an important word. And so, I mean, I'd love to talk a little bit about, you figured it out. You had figured it out prior to even starting in EMS. So tell us about the quilting, because I find that very fascinating, that, something that one would not think of as being a strategy that you would use, and how it has helped.
Yeah. And I didn't really actually know that I was doing that all that time until the psychologist or psychiatrist. I'm not even sure if I had a psychiatrist or psychologist, but anyway, until my counselor told me that I was doing that, I didn't actually know. But the first time that I really recollect stitching through something I was really dealing with emotionally was when my grandmother passed away. And this was in the 90s, but it was getting towards the end of my career, and she passed away at a time when I was really struggling with my career, and so many things were happening all at the same time. And she was such a key figure in my life. And the loss of her was just something I was like, going to be leading the funeral. I was going to be speaking. I was going to be organizing everything. I was going to be going through her belongings. I just was one of the people in my family who took charge of all those things. And I said to my husband, I have a huge quilting retreat this weekend. Should I even go? I have so much to do. And thank goodness my husband said, you have to go. That is the thing you have to do to deal with this. And I remember stitching into the wee hours of the night at this retreat when everyone else is in bed, and just crying and stitching and just dealing with this. And I have that art piece hanging above my fireplace to this day that I made. I made a textile art piece, and it was a gorgeous landscape in colors that my grandmother would have loved. And I just, I made something that would just make me feel connected to her. And so many of I'm a textile artist, and I teach quilting, and I speak and judge in the quilting world, and I travel all over the world. But the thing that I really do is I bring artfulness to quilters. So you might think, my grandmother's quilt, the quilt on a bed. I bring artfulness to quilters, and I get them to be creative and just really use their mind in their process. And I now teach classes called Healing Stitches and those kind of things for organizations like school divisions. And I'll go into a school division and I will teach a class where they have to choose from a list of words, or they have to pick a word that is very meaningful to them. And we incorporate it into our art piece, and we're stitching and hand stitching, and we're creating this. And I did this recently, actually went back to Central Canada where I was working. I was invited. This was kind of a really funny little story. I do all this quilting stuff, and everyone can see me on social media. But this gal called me up, and I had hired her to work on the fire safety house in my career as a firefighter. And she said she's the head of education at a school division, and she wants to bring me in to teach for some of her teachers on a professional development day. It's kind of comes full circle, right? So I go in and teach, and we're choosing our words and creating our art. And then all of a sudden I realize 3 women, teachers, art teachers, counselors, 3 women at this table are all sitting there crying together. I was like, why are you guys crying? And they said, we were so excited that we could pick a PD day that was kind of crafty. And we're all just realizing in this moment that we're all dealing with a trauma that happened to us a few weeks ago in our school, where a child committed suicide. And they're all picked words to deal with that. And they're all stitching, and they're talking about it, and they're dealing with it. And they all just realized at once that this was happening in that class. And so you never know when something's going to pop into your mind or be triggered or whatever, but moving your hands and your mind and doing something methodical is just a way to work through the trauma. And
have you ever heard of EMDR?
Yes, I have had
so
EMDR.
I'm a practitioner.
Yeah.
And it's making me think that and this is coming just off the top of my head now with your quilting, because I hadn't really thought this through, is that with trauma, with the 5 sensory, what happens is the body and the brain takes what it needs to be able to cope through something that generally I say is unbearable.
Yeah.
And then it's like having bits and bytes coming at you, right? Yeah. It could be a thought, it could be a feeling, it could be a body sensation, whatever. Yeah. And EMDR, with kind of, it's a process where you go back and forth with the left and right hemisphere, with either sound or touch. But what it does is it simulates the right and left hemisphere to get you outside of the conscious brain into the unconscious brain. So I'm thinking about your description here, right? So think about it. It's kind of like you're so focused with the tactile, the sensory, emotion, that I wonder, and this might be something for you with you in your kind of world, because you live in it, about if that's the override that allows people to drop down. But because what we know is that with trauma, there's no beginning, middle, and end. Yeah. And with reprocessing of trauma, that's the context that you're actually putting in. So I wonder if that's what the quilting does, is it gets you to go back to that earlier version of whenever the trauma event occurred. And then you're just kind of touching it and by staying outside of the conscious brain. This is that just came to me in a wave, just listening to the quilting.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating because if you think of my particular case, in my counseling, we've dealt with two completely different things. So I have this recurring trauma that was traumatic events that I witnessed. Those are completely gone. They're so suppressed, I can't remember any of them. None. And so that's really concerning. And that's something I've been dealing with for years in counseling. When it comes to the toxic workplace, I remember everything. So it's completely different, right? So when if I'm figuring out how I'm going to deal with the stuff that is so suppressed that I can't even remember, like there are times when I don't even know any of the details about some things. So I'll give you an example. Like people who do not have PTSD don't really realize, oh, we'll just remove the trigger and you'll be fine. No, it doesn't work like that, right? They don't realize how it comes about. So I was recently judging a quilt show, and I was traveling, and I put some deodorant on, and my travel deodorant was so worn out that it crumbled and it ran out. So I had to run to the store, grab some deodorant, and I came back and put it on, and I thought, oh, I hate that smell. Why did I get baby powder? Darn it. I was disappointed with myself. For some reason, I hate that smell. But then I had a shower at the end of the day, went to bed, and I had the worst night terrors I have had in ages. And this is part of how my PTSD manifests in night terrors. And this entire incident came back to me that I completely had forgotten about it. Of course, it was a child mortality, and
Yes.
baby powder was the thing that caused the mortality. And so I never have night terrors when I'm traveling. It's a different place. It's not my own home where, I have night terrors. Now at home, when I put my head on the pillow, I always get anxiety. I have to do a calming routine before bed because I have night terrors. I never have them when I'm travel, but that smell actually triggered the whole incident. And then I'm able to go to counseling and do EMDR and all that and deal with that situation because I realize, oh yeah, I remember some of those things.
And that's the thing, right? I think, so well said when you say people that don't understand PTSD, that they say, oh, well, just, stay away from people, places, and things.
Yeah.
But I always say it's the subtle little buggers that are in the recesses of your unconscious, like the smell of baby powder that you don't even remember. And then all of a sudden something comes up because I always say the brain and the body is ready to release it, if that makes sense, right? And people go, what do you mean? I go, no, seriously. If that wasn't safe enough for it to come up at that time, the body and the brain would not have released it, even though you're thinking, Roxanne, that's night terrors. Who feels good with those? But, if it's too quick, that's where, unfortunately, it can be tough on the person, right? So it's fascinating, how things do evolve when the body and the brain comes about. So let's talk a little bit more about the quilting, the connection, the feeling, and kind of what you do out there, Brandy, in the world. Because I think you and I could probably keep talking at with all the stuff. And I'm so glad that we got connected the way we did. What a fascinating conversation to have had today. Tell me a little bit more about that and kind of more about what you do out there in the world. Like you said, you do this internationally, you speak, those types. I'm sure people that are listening are curious as I am.
Yeah, absolutely. So my business is called Quilter on Fire. So firefighter to quilter is kind of a fun play on words, but I teach and speak and judge quilt shows. And I have a podcast called the Quilter on Fire podcast. I've been doing that for years. And so there's three things that I bring to the world. I bring education and teaching quilters to become artful in their quilting. I have a community with my podcast, and then I have quilt travel destinations. So I travel all over the world to quilt shows, and I bring tours of quilters. And I've really turned my, turning craft to healing into a huge part of my business, because my lecture is called Your Mind Matters. And I have multiple lectures. One's on judging. I have a few different lectures, but this trunk show, we call it in the quilting world, is a show where I show all of my work and all of my quilts over the years. But I've infused 5 messages into my trunk show called Your Mind Matters. And the messages, the reason I decided to do these messages is because it's helped me so much. And although I know, I'm very well aware that not everyone has PTSD, there are people out there who have it and don't know it. But people deal with all kinds of trauma in their lives, whether it's just being shunned from a group of people or being abused verbally by someone, or, and so when I do my trunk show or my lecture, I always have people coming up at the end saying, you just opened my eyes to something that I hadn't even realized was happening to me, or I really resonated with your story, and I'm going to keep quilting because that's my saving grace. And I get those kind of comments at the end. And so the reason I came up with these 5 life lessons was because my best friend is a counselor. And so she spent her full career, she's a social worker with her master's degree, but she spent her full career in school division as sort of the lead social worker. She recently retired and she has become a counselor full-time, which is her true passion. And so I got together with her on a girls' weekend. We live far apart. She lives in central Canada. I live in BC. And we got together on a girls' weekend at this resort. It was amazing. And we sat down with a glass of wine and we hashed out 5 life lessons that based on what's happened to me in my life and what I could really talk about to help other people. And so if you want, I'll just quickly tell you the life lessons. There's 5 of them. The first one is to surround yourself with those who lift you up. The second lesson is to quilt to de-stress and calm your mind. The third life lesson is to practice gratitude and affirmations and form good habits. Number 4 is to do the work before you're ready in the quilting world. And then life lesson number 5 is the one that's most important for me, and that is care for yourself first. So many people care for others, care for others, care for others. And if there's anything left in the bottom of their cup, they care for themselves last. And that's what I do most. So, just trying to teach my son, I'm telling him, care for yourself first until your cup is overflowing, and then you can give to others as well. So
what an amazing 5 steps, like such good learnings. And this has been, thank you for your time. And for anybody that is listening, that, and I think, for senior leaders to really listen, to think it doesn't, we were talking about EMS services, but, trauma, be it small or big T trauma, is the reality of what is happening out there in the world. And someone may be working with you, but you have to still think that they bring themselves with them, and they may be experiencing some of the things that we've discussed today. So to really think through, how are you creating the space to support people that may be having symptoms that do not make sense? Ensuring that you have things that they can support them, whether it's clinical services, coaching, having somebody like Brandy come in and do a workshop, or a speaking event. What a gift to be able to put context for people to say that healing should be the first thing. And when people are happy, connected, and not distracted by symptoms, then they bring the best version of themselves to work. And we all want to, I think, stay connected at work. So Brandy, if people wanted to get a hold of you, they wanted to work with you, they wanted to go on one of these world retreats, which sounds like fun right about now, where can they get a hold of you?
My website is quilteronfire.com, and you can find me everywhere on the socials as the Quilter on Fire.
Awesome. So for everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. I'm going to think about what kind of things can I do to help me soothe myself. That's and something that I love to do. So I also challenge you to do the same. And you may be already doing it, or maybe it's something that you need to explore. So for anyone wanting to connect with me, you can go to my website. If you're wanting to know about your ability to connect and be mentally resilient, either at work or at home, just go to roxannedurhodge.com/quiz. You'll get a little mini quiz, and when you fill it out, we'll send you some recommendations. And my book is attached to it, both of them. You can get some more information there, or just reach out to me. So again, Brandy, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there again with me this week, and we will chat again with you next week. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to Authentic Living with Roxanne, creating the space for positive, healthy change. Roxanne is a keynote speaker, psychotherapist, and coach. To work with Roxanne, visit roxannederhage.com/blueprint. We'll see you next time on Authentic Living with Roxanne.